Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute, and today I'm joined by Michael Beeman. Michael Beeman was Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC at USTR from 2017 to 2023, where he led negotiations for the U.S.-Japan Trade Agreement and the updated Korea-U.S. FTA. He served at USTR for over a decade, including as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan. He is also the author of Walking Out, America's New Trade Policy in the Asia-Pacific and Beyond. He will be a lecturer at the University of California at San Diego in the fall of 2025. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Thanks much for the invitation. Glad to be back.
And we've got a lot to talk about because so much is going on in the trade space between the U.S. and Korea and between the U.S. and the world. But I wonder if you could start by telling us what you think the main objectives are driving Trump's tariff policy. And is there an alignment within the administration, or do you think there are competing perspectives?
Well, that is a big question. And I think it's fair to say that inevitably there is a certain degree of competing objectives because the president has outlined so many different justifications for taking on all these tariff actions. So be it the U.S. was ripped off or some of these kinds of issues to national security issues of fairness or reciprocity, boosting manufacturing, gaining tariff revenue. There's a lot of competing policy objectives. So to a certain degree, different agencies are going to have different takes on what's most important and what they're trying to push forward to meet, the president's agenda. But and now we have political objectives that have been squarely put on the table in terms of some of the tariff actions. So it is pretty confusing. But I still see this as more of a continuous kind of thread that I talked about when I was speaking here last fall, which is ultimate goal is to reset the terms of trade, America's terms of trade with the world, and to do so at a substantially higher tariff rate. And really, in many ways, going back to the quote unquote protective tariff that was the norm in political discourse in the United States literally 100 years ago, before FDR kind of put all this on a new trajectory. So I think the hallmark of all this isn't just returning to that philosophy and that approach with many different goals in mind in order to realize that objective, but also the modality, of course, is the hallmark here, and this is taking a very, very zero-sum approach to trade in order to do this. And this is what I was talking about last fall and kind of predicting that this was going to come and this was going to be very serious and it was going to be a major thing. Here we are. And the zero-sum approach, what it means is, the world gives and the U.S. gets, basically. And certainly the U.S. doesn't really give a lot of weight to the totality of relationships. This is the zero-sum thinking and defining specific aspects of the relationship in a zero-sum way. Trump's, to use the word, the thinking of relationships in the totality, basically. And this is why the zero-sum thinking is why, Korea in many ways feels like it's being treated the same as the EU, as Argentina, as, many other different kinds of countries. And so it's all through this kind of lens of zero sum. And, why the U.S., the only concessions the U.S. is willing to give is to go easier on countries unless they show their, appreciation for being able to do business in the United States. It's just fundamentally different than we've experienced in 100 years.
Well, that definitely provides the context. I want to dig into the specifics of the current tariff negotiations between the U.S. and Korea. And I understand that there are 6 major areas: balanced trade, non-tariff measures, economic security, digital trade, country of origin, and commercial considerations. Which of these issues do you think is the highest priority for the Trump administration, and what are the major issues that need to be dealt with by each side as they negotiate a new set of trade arrangements?
Sure. I think, many of these issues I see as, kind of code for certain objectives, basically. Things like, I think you mentioned balanced trade, and that's obviously Korea buying more things, or non-tariff measures is very similar to digital trade, and that's also has to do with the export component and balancing and fairness and reciprocity. Country of origin is in commercial considerations and national economic security, I think, are all kind of China-related in one way, shape, or form. And I'm not sure the U.S. is using those particular categories, but nonetheless, I think they really point to two ultimate objectives here. Number one is eliminating the trade deficit with all countries, and so in this case with Korea, which is a pretty large goods trade deficit, I should point out, not services, which is the surplus. So that's the top priority, however defined and however achieved. The second, I think, is a close second, which is closing the back door of America's market to China. So the back door means going through third countries, however that is dealt with, and to be dealing with the challenge that China presents, be it through industrial competitiveness, economic security, or literally issues like transshipment.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll get back to the back door, I think, a little bit more, but I want to focus on the 25% tariff rate, the reciprocal tariff rate that Korea was assigned. And I'm curious if you have any insight into how that number might have been derived and how it puts pressure on South Korea to reduce the trade imbalance.
Sure. I mean, I think how it was derived is that I think originally was through that pretty kooky formula that was announced and created, which literally, made clear to me that the whole focus on reciprocity wasn't about what the tariff rates are. If, I think the president often talked about, countries have much higher tariff rates in the U.S. Of course, under the Chorus agreement, basically virtually everything is now zero on both sides. So that is, in that definition, reciprocal. But it turns out that's really not what the goal was, right? Reciprocity was really measured in terms of outcomes and results, not in terms of terms and conditions, basically. So this is where reciprocal tariffs, it's really about, the trade imbalance, and that was what that formula was all about. So the question is, what can be. I also, really feel that in addition to that formula, the reason the 25% keeps coming up time and time again, it really is. I don't have evidence for this, but I feel very strongly was baked in the first administration when we were talking about truck tariffs, the 25% chicken tax, quote unquote, with the EU that became the 25% tariff on pickup trucks, was seen in the Trump administration as having enabled a sanctuary market in the U.S., as being high enough to have prevented virtually all imports of pickup trucks from around the world, and therefore the market was going to exist in the United States. And that 25% just keeps popping up time and time again. So I think that there's actually, that mental connection continues today as a tariff rate that's high enough to basically prohibit trade, and for most manufactured goods in particular, and why Korea, with a big auto surplus, is still facing that tariff both on a national basis as well as on the 232 Section 232 auto tariff, specific auto tariff. That's a global tariff.
Okay. So I think we've moved from the post-Liberation Day phase to the letters phase, perhaps, in the second Trump administration's approach. And we've got two deals in a little bit over 90 days instead of 90. What do you think that South Korea can learn from the deals that have been made so far with the UK and with Vietnam?
Well, there are two different cases because with the UK, the US has a trade goods surplus with the UK. And I think that, but the UK still ended up with a 10% tariff rate on all of its exports to the US, even with a quote unquote deal, which goes to my point about this reset and this determination to just blanket put a protective tariff in across the world, and then some countries will go higher than that, basically. That's unrealistic, I think, for a lot of countries that have been caught up in this because particularly those with trade deficits or that don't have something really major to bring to the table to help get out from under a potentially higher tariff rate. So for Vietnam, I think, is the example of this, right? Apparently, well, we'll see, because I think the terms are still a little fuzzy and maybe still under negotiation to a certain degree. Vietnam has a very large trade surplus with the U.S., so the U.S. has a trade deficit with them in goods, but ended up with a 20% tariff rate. So including after all the concessions that Vietnam made. So this was a concessionary rate, right, over compared to what Vietnam was originally assigned. So I see countries like Korea, I see Japan in the same bucket, I see the EU in a similar bucket as being able to get out from under the highest tariffs that have been threatened, but with some kind of deal. And I'm still a believer, and I've been saying this for a long time, that somewhere in the 10 to 20% range on average is the likely outcome here. I think for Korea, it's probably in the 15 to 18% with a deal that is seen as a successful deal in the Oval Office. That is still a major tariff on a lot of exports. That's just an average tariff. So some of the autos, steel, and other tariffs, I think Korea may be able to moderate some of those terms, but there's still going to be really large tariffs. And I think this is the world that the president is clearly trying to create. And, I think countries are just now having to come to terms with that reality.
Okay, and so you're talking about a negotiation whereby it's possible to get to a lower reciprocal tariff, but President Trump, in his letter to Lee Jae Myung, also threatened the possibility that tariffs rates could go up.
Yep.
How do you view that?
I think it's a real concern that all countries should take seriously. I think I've been saying for many, many months now, and I feel like I'm just repeating myself, but I think a lot of what I've been saying is now finally being understood as fact, that there's two theories about the unpredictability and the chaos that kind of, threat brings. One is that this is the style of the president and the style of the Oval Office, and I think there's something to be said for that. It is kind of chaotic compared to most U.S. administrations, I think. But it also really reflects the fact that chaos and unpredictability is part of the plan. Countries may make concessions and get to a lower tariff rate, still come out, feeling like they're losing overall, but better off than they would have been otherwise. But with this kind of existential threat of those terms being changed in the future, that is part of the plan. That is part of the style that the administration dabbled with a little bit during the first term. That has come, roaring back, and it's all about keeping the business environment uncertain. And the whole point of this goes back to what the president says time and time again: businesses, if you want to make stuff overseas and send it to the U.S., have at it, but it's at your risk and at your peril potentially. If you set up shop here, then you won't have to worry about that. I think this whole idea of keeping everyone off balance, of course, is the style of the president, but also very much the style of the policy they're trying to implement, which is so I think it is a real problem for countries that are seeking an accommodation, because I think it's a real risk that could come unglued, weeks or months or a year or two later.
Okay. Let me also ask you about Section 232 tariffs that are hitting Korea pretty hard in a number of sectors: automobiles, steel. We've got the prospect of additional tariffs in semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. Do you see that as a better source of leverage for the Trump administration, or how does it fit into the style that you have described?
Yeah, that is the layering on top of the Section 232 tariffs in the way that, on top of the quote unquote reciprocal tariffs, in the way that it's happened, has been, taken this further than I think it's fair to say even I expected. I knew there would be some of this, but they just announced two more potential 232 investigations yesterday into other sectors. So this is obviously going to continue. So the question is, what is a real number? Obviously, it's going to affect the profitability of Korean companies and the very concentrated exports in steel and, in aluminum, but particularly steel, and in autos and auto parts to the United States. So, and in computer chips as well, and those products that are made from those and derivative products. So there are many different components that are directly in the crosshairs of these 232 tariffs. And I think, this is going to, I think they're very serious about trying to maintain and provide as few exceptions to those as possible. I think there are ways in which certain countries can moderate certain aspects of those tariffs and may be able to gain certain advantages for their own exports vis-a-vis other countries that are subject to them. But it's going to take, quite a lot of capitulation to achieve that, including things like voluntary export restraints, including things like Korea might get some consideration based on the number of cars the U.S. is shipping to Korea, which is not tiny, but it's not much compared to what goes the other direction. In exchange for basically lower tariffs for that amount of exports and not for the full amount of Korea's exports. I can imagine a few different ways to slice that up, but at the end of the day, it's Korea is on the table in terms of the slicing and those exports.
So I'm wondering, what is your advice generally to negotiators about how to deal with prospective 232s? Because semiconductors, we have an ongoing negotiation, but semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, who knows what's next, could be on the table. How do you protect yourself from the prospective application of sectoral tariffs being applied in the future?
It's really challenging because, those actions have not been taken yet. And so the degree to which they're going to impact Korea is unknown. What other sectors may come up are unknown. So, here I'm completely speaking off the cuff. This is just how this kind of problem might be resolved in a trade negotiation, which would be, all right, let's say that Korea really bites the bullet and is going to make a dramatic change in the trade deficit, however that's achieved. And, one possibility is after a year or so, if the deficit is decreased, by a certain metric and is on target to move towards zero, which is just a huge thing to imagine on its face, but obviously what the president wants, then, perhaps you can get a deal where, if that metric is met, then Korea will only be assessed 10% tariffs on these goods. This has shown that it's able to manage its exports and prevent this kind of, the trade deficit from returning, basically. The other, so that's a negotiating approach to dealing with that, given the realities of the situation. It's not my suggestion. This is just the reality of the room. The other thing to do for Korea is, frankly, to wait until, to go along with what the world has assessed and wait until U.S. companies that need these inputs, that need these products are hurt enough to complain enough so that there's a moderation that takes place, and then it may open room for further negotiation in the future. That's not the approach that your question is asking, but that is maybe a more realistic kind of a way of thinking about what may happen going forward.
No, that's very useful. I want to go back to the back door, the issue of transshipments. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me at this particular moment, there's a lot of mixed signals, right? Especially as related to semiconductors, because on the one hand, Samsung and SK Hynix really want to keep open the ability to engage in some semiconductor trade with China. On the other hand, this week it seems like NVIDIA has some special dispensation to bypass some of those restrictions that commerce has applied. And Korea is in this strange space where a lot of supply chains are going through China. So how vulnerable do you think South Korea is on the transshipment front, and what is the way forward?
So I think what you're saying or suggesting is, or the question is, if Korea really bites the bullet and cuts a lot of the cords with China, will the rug get pulled out from under it? Will the U.S. pull the rug out and advantage itself by cutting some side deal with China? I think it's a huge risk. I think that there is a sense that the president has if the president sees an opportunity to cut a deal with China as defined in China's terms in order to get something in return, that it could come back and bite countries that and companies that thought they were following the line that they needed to follow in order to maintain a special relationship and to do business in the United States. So I don't have a really good answer for that because I think it is an ongoing risk.
Okay. And I also want to ask you about, we know that new South Korean president, Lee Jae Myung, wants to come to Washington at some point and meet President Trump. But, he's had a very short runway to be able to arrive at some kind of understanding with the Trump administration on tariffs as a new administration itself. It's complicated because on the one hand, they've never met. It would be a first meeting. But then you also have this pressure to consummate some kind of deal. What do you think is the best approach to have a meeting to establish the relationship and set aside the prospect of deal making, or potentially to make the first meeting the meeting at which you actually make a deal?
I think it's a great question, but I think it's a really difficult one to answer and will depend so much on what the new president might have to, quote unquote, bring to Washington with him, and the degree to which that may be, the opportunity to close a deal or to establish a relationship. Or, if we look back at the case of President Moon, when he came to Washington, what he got was, right after being elected in similar circumstances, what he got was an announcement that we were renegotiating KORUS. So I think there is a real risk, and I think it will really depend on how far the negotiations with Korea have advanced, what additional items that the new president has to bring to Washington. And that's not just in trade. That has to do with defense. That has to do with, maybe even currency. It has to do with a range of issues. Because to go back to kind of what I obliquely referred to earlier, the president has put trade in the middle of determining and evaluating what a relationship is with every country. It's very much at the center, as I was, talking about. Actually, when I was here last November, I was making the same point. And so it's seen as a totality, kind of a package in many ways. So I think it really will depend on what this package looks like and the degree to which it will resonate, or Korea feels it will resonate with the president as a country that's willing to really stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. and to go along with a lot of these demands that the president is making.
Okay. Well, at the risk of kind of closing on a down note, so
many things I speak at. I feel like at the very end, I always have to make the point. I feel like the prophet of doom, but I feel I've been right. Well, I'm sorry to say.
I hate to put you in that position, but I want to ask you about the trajectory of global trade policy and where you think we're going to be in the next 2 or 3 years.
Well, I think this pressure that you see coming from Washington in one way or another is just going to be a new feature of U.S. relationships. And I think it's likely to be moderated, and mainly because of domestic pressure and domestic realities that we haven't fully seen yet. Economic Wall Street, which I think is, kind of really way too optimistic. I remember back when I was in the Trump administration the first time, I'd see what was going on Wall Street, and I just felt this sense of real unease because I knew the chaos that was going on and the unpredictability, and at any moment things could drop that would just, blow that sentiment up pretty radically. In the end, somehow it was managed, and a lot of those really challenging things didn't come out. But it really is, I think it's very present at this point. We'll see what happens. But to circle back to your question, I am worried about the international trading system. And I think the fact the U.S. is putting pressure on individual countries to make special deals with the U.S., for anyone who knows trade, knows how that reverberates, because the whole point of most favored nation status is everyone wants what the terms the other country got. So if Vietnam lowers all of its tariffs to zero, everyone's going to want that from Vietnam now that doesn't have a trade agreement with them that does that already. And this is the same dynamic that's going to come up. So really, to me, it's the degree to which other countries are able to maintain their commitment to the rules and to the system over as the U.S. is kind of being a disturber over here, as China has been as well, and able to rally around that system and hold that together as to and keep it from fragmenting too much, I think is a real test of what the world will look like in 3 or 4 years' time.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. And you've mentioned on a number of occasions the program we did last November, which highlighted your book, Walking Out. And we will put a link to that presentation and to your book in our show notes. But thank you so much for joining us today. Really glad to have you. Thanks.
I hope this is helpful. It is, a challenge to interpret what's going on, but I think for someone who served in the first administration, understanding the feelings and emotions and the way of thinking, it's not terribly difficult to talk about for me.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us on Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.